I am not Mom's servant. That was what my son said. Right there in the penthouse overlooking Central Park, just as my wife came home exhausted after a dialysis session. I stood there, still holding the lease contract I had just signed, the one I took so I could pay for her treatment. My wife's lips were cracked and dry. She quietly asked for some water. My son kept staring at his financial screen, as if the woman who had raised him his entire life was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his busy day. If you're listening to this story and something about it feels familiar, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll keep telling it, slowly and in full, about what happened after that moment, when a sentence that sounded so small began to tear an entire family apart. I set the contract down on the kitchen table, right next to a stack of hospital letters I hadn't even opened yet. Beyond the glass walls, Manhattan was still glowing. Cars moved on as if nothing had happened inside this home. But inside the penthouse, the air turned thick. My wife lay on her side on the sofa, a thin blanket pulled across her body. Every time she breathed, her shoulders barely moved, slow and heavy, as if each breath had to ask permission from a body already worn out. That dialysis session had lasted longer than usual. By the time I got home, she had been there for nearly an hour. No one asked how she was. No one made her a warm glass of water. Her lips were so dry they had split into tiny cracks, like soil after a long drought. I bent down and asked if she was okay. She nodded almost imperceptibly, then whispered that she was thirsty. I turned to Caleb. He was sitting at the dining table, laptop open. Green and red charts flickered nonstop. His fingers tapped lightly on the table, steady, impatient. I asked for one simple thing, just one. Get his mother a glass of warm water. Add the electrolytes, the doctor recommended. Nothing more. He didn't look up right away. A few seconds of silence passed. Then he exhaled sharply and slammed the laptop shut, as if I had interrupted something critical. The words came out clean and cold. He was not his mother's servant. He was handling important work. I could do it myself. Melanie was standing nearby. She didn't look at my wife. She looked around the room, frowned, and said the smell of medicine was ruining the atmosphere. Her afternoon tea with friends was coming up, and she didn't want the penthouse to feel like a hospital room. I didn't respond. I was used to silence in the courtroom, but this silence was heavier than any trial I had ever presided over. I went into the kitchen and boiled the water myself. While waiting, I looked back at my wife. She used to be the first one awake every morning. Early shifts at the bakery, midday at the diner, evenings cleaning offices. 3 jobs, for years, so Caleb could study properly and never worry about tuition. The water boiled. I mixed the electrolytes and brought the glass out. I helped her sit up. Her hands trembled slightly. I had to hold the glass so she could drink, one small sip at a time. Caleb stood up and walked into his office without another word. Melanie started making calls, her voice cheerful, talking about fresh flowers, lighting guest lists. That night, I helped my wife lie down. She fell asleep quickly, completely drained. I stayed beside her, watching her face. Under the warm yellow light, she looked so much older than a few years ago. Not because of the illness, but because indifference had been wearing her down day after day. I got up and walked into the living room. Caleb and Melanie were discussing moving more money into a new investment account. They spoke quickly in low voices, but loud enough for me to hear. Numbers were mentioned casually, as if money simply appeared on its own, untouched by sweat or pain. I interrupted them. Just one sentence. Calm, short. They should pack their bags tonight. Caleb looked up frozen. Melanie let out a small laugh, thinking I was joking. I continued. No raised voice. No anger. By morning, the Tesla Caleb was using would be taken back. The secondary credit card would be locked. The room went silent. Melanie asked what I meant. Caleb jumped to his feet, demanding if I knew what I was doing. I knew exactly what I was doing. I had thought it through the entire drive home after signing that contract. I signed it to buy my wife a few more months of treatment. I did not sign it to raise ingratitude inside my own home. I didn't explain further. I turned around and went back to the bedroom. That night, I couldn't sleep. I heard suitcases being dragged, heard hushed arguments, held back to avoid making noise. I lay beside my wife, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in many years, I asked myself where I had gone wrong. The next morning, when sunlight filled the living room, the penthouse felt strangely quiet. Caleb and Melanie were gone. A half-finished cup of coffee still sat on the table. The laptop was no longer there. I stood in the middle of that large home, feeling empty, not because of the space, but because I had just understood something clearly. I had indulged my son for far too long, and the price was not money. It was the dignity of the woman I love most. I knew then, from the moment Caleb spoke those words, a door had closed. No noise, no tears, but final. After that quiet morning, I began doing what I should have done much earlier. Not as an angry father, but as a husband trying to hold on to whatever could still be saved. I took Beatrice back to the hospital for another evaluation. The doctor said her kidneys had weakened more than expected. We needed to be financially prepared for long-term options. I nodded, as if the words didn't surprise me. On the way home, she held my hand and quietly asked if Caleb was doing okay. I said he was. I didn't want her carrying another burden. That afternoon, while Beatrice slept, I went into my study. I hadn't used that room in a long time. Old case files from my years on the bench still lined the shelves. I turned on the computer and logged into our family financial accounts. I moved slowly, carefully, the same way I once examined every small detail in a case. At first, everything looked normal, until I opened the savings fund in Beatrice's name. That fund had been set up years ago, strictly for her treatment, and if needed, a kidney transplant. I saw withdrawals that didn't match the medical payment schedule, large amounts, split into several transfers, sent to a familiar account. The account holder was Caleb. I sat there for a long time, not because of the money, but because of the choice behind it. I opened the detailed transaction history. The withdrawals lined up with days of heavy market volatility. I didn't need to ask anything else to understand what had happened. Just then, I heard Melanie's voice drifting in from the hallway. She was on the phone, speaking low but fast. I wasn't trying to listen. The door was slightly open, and the words found their way to me. She was urging someone, most likely Caleb, to act faster, saying they couldn't let me keep control, saying that if they could prove I was no longer as sharp as before, everything would be easy. She mentioned paperwork, friendly doctors, a plan that sounded smooth, almost rehearsed. When the call ended, I remained still. In all my years in the profession, I had heard false testimony, stories built to hide ambition, but I never thought I would be the target of such a script inside my own family. That evening, I went through the unopened envelopes. One letter from the bank made my hand stop. It stated that the penthouse was being used as collateral for a loan. I read it again and again. My name and Beatrice's were printed there, but the signatures were not ours. I knew my own signature better than anyone. That penthouse was the only property we jointly owned. I had never authorized it to be mortgaged. I called the bank to confirm. The representative said everything was in order. All documents had been properly submitted. I thanked them and hung up. I didn't argue over the phone. I needed to see the full picture before speaking. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the study, the desk lamp shining down on the pages I had just printed. Each transaction, each signature, each timestamp. When placed together, they formed a story that was cold and unmistakable. Caleb hadn't just taken his mother's money. He had put this entire home at risk, just to cover for his reckless decisions. The next morning, I began making calls. Not many, only to people whose competence and discretion I trusted. An old lawyer, an independent financial expert, and someone who once worked with me in the court system. I didn't complain. I simply laid out the facts and asked them to verify and document everything precisely. Meanwhile, Melanie began preparing for the upscale gathering she had mentioned before. There was someone ill in the house, but flowers still arrived. Wine was neatly arranged in the cabinet. She moved through the penthouse, talking to the event planner, as if everything were unfolding exactly as planned. Caleb started showing up more often. He seemed restless, asking about the accounts, about the locked cards. I only said everything was under review. He looked at me longer than usual, his eyes mixed with suspicion and irritation. I watched them quietly, every word, every gesture. They were placing themselves deeper into their own story. I didn't need to rush. I only needed time. A few days later, the first reports arrived. Every suspicion was confirmed. The withdrawals, the mortgage, and the carefully altered documents designed to slip past the system. I read them slowly. There was no sense of victory, only a deep settling exhaustion. I looked toward the bedroom where Beatrice was resting. She didn't know someone had been quietly turning her weakness into a tool. I sat beside her, held her hand, and told myself this story would not end in silence. I was no longer acting as a father, hoping his son would come to his senses. I was acting as a protector, and when every piece finally fell into place, I knew the moment of exposure was only a matter of time. When the day of the party arrived, I didn't stop it. I let everything unfold exactly the way they wanted. Flowers arrived early that morning. Large arrangements, their scent stronger than the lingering smell of medicine in the house. Staff moved quietly, checking the lighting, arranging glasses. Melanie directed everything with a firm voice, as if this penthouse had belonged to her for years. I took Beatrice into the inner bedroom. She was tired, but still asked why the house felt so crowded. I told her it was just a short gathering. I didn't want her to worry. I drew the curtains and told her to rest. When I closed the door, I stood still for a few seconds, listening to laughter drifting in from the living room. It sounded so unfamiliar. It made me feel like I was somewhere else, not at home. I changed clothes. Nothing elaborate, just the dark suit I used to wear for important hearings. I didn't need to impress anyone. I needed clarity. When I stepped into the living room, it was already full. Familiar faces from the financial world. A few partners I recognized from Caleb's dealings. Melanie moved among them, her smile perfectly measured. The conversations revolved around projects, expansion, plans, and promises that sounded smooth and confident. Caleb stood near the bar. He looked self-assured, glass in hand, speaking about the future as if everything were already secured. I stayed near the edge of the room watching. At first, no one paid attention to me. That worked in my favor. I wanted to hear them talk, to know what they believed. Midway through the evening, Caleb tapped his glass lightly. The room quieted. He began his speech. He spoke about family, about support, about how the older generation had laid the foundation so the next could move forward. Melanie stood beside him, nodding her gaze, fixed on the most important guests. I stepped forward just as Caleb finished. No interruption, no rush. I simply stood there. A few people turned to look at me, surprised. Melanie forced a smile and came closer, whispering that I should go back to my room, that I wasn't well. She said it loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. I didn't respond to her. I looked straight at Caleb. Then I spoke calmly, saying I wanted to share something brief with everyone. A few curious looks, a few furrowed brows. Melanie smiled again, explaining that I sometimes got confused, that I needed rest. She said it as if apologizing on my behalf. I let her finish. When she fell silent, I gestured to the building manager. The sound system was turned on. The room went completely still as the recording played. Caleb's voice was clear, unmistakable. He talked about withdrawing money from his mother's fund to cover failed investments. He said it was temporary. He said no one needed to know. No one spoke. Melanie froze. Caleb turned toward me, his face drained of color. I didn't stop. I handed copies of documents to a few of Caleb's key partners. No long explanations, just numbers, signatures, timelines. I continued slowly, saying that this penthouse had been mortgaged without my wife or me ever knowing. I didn't use harsh words. I simply said it had been done improperly. I said I had verified everything, and I said it was my responsibility to inform the people standing there because they deserved to know who they were working with. Caleb stepped forward, trying to interrupt. Melanie grabbed his arm, whispering something to him. I looked at them, and for the first time that evening I saw panic. Not about honor, but about consequences drawing near. I didn't accuse. I didn't boast. I said one final sentence. In my family, caring for the weakest person is not a choice. It is a responsibility. And when that responsibility is ignored, every other agreement becomes meaningless. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Some people set their glasses down. Some excused themselves and left early. Quiet, hurried conversations began in corners of the room. Melanie tried to keep smiling, but no one returned it. Caleb stood still, eyes fixed on the floor. I turned and walked toward Beatrice's bedroom. Before going in, I paused. I didn't need to look back at that room anymore. I had said enough. What came next was no longer in my hands, but in the hands of the truth. When I closed the door, the noise outside faded. Beatrice was still asleep. I sat beside her. I didn't feel relief. I only felt that something had been put back where it belonged, and I knew that after this evening, nothing could ever return to the way it was before. After the bedroom door closed, I sat still for a long time. Footsteps in the hallway became scattered. Hushed whispers tried to stay contained. Then the elevator doors closed in waves. The party ended faster than I expected. No goodbyes, no well wishes. Only the hurried retreat of people who had just realized they were standing on the wrong side. I thought it would end there. But Caleb didn't stop. When the apartment was finally quiet, he pounded on the bedroom door. I stepped out. His eyes were red, not from regret, but from fear of losing control. He spoke fast, said I had ruined everything, said I didn't understand the market, said what I had done would push the whole family into a dead end. I listened, didn't interrupt. Then he said the one thing that told me I had been right all along. He said that if I kept making this bigger, he would place his mother in a public care facility. He said they would take care of her there. Cheaper, more convenient for everyone. He said it like he was discussing a reasonable option. I looked at him, and for the first time I no longer saw my son. I saw someone trying to use another person's weakness to protect his own interests. I told him to sit down. My voice wasn't loud, but the room went still. I went into the study and took out a thin folder. I placed it on the table in front of Caleb and Melanie, who had just walked in, trying and failing to stay calm. I told them there was something they had never asked me about, and something I had never volunteered to explain. When I drafted my will and the asset transfer agreements years ago, I didn't think only about money. I opened the page I had marked. I read slowly. There was a moral clause. Not long, not complicated. It stated clearly, if an heir abandons, exploits, or causes harm to their parents when those parents are no longer able to protect themselves, all benefits end immediately. No debate, no negotiation. Melanie shook her head, saying it was unreasonable, that no one did things like that anymore. Caleb let out a sharp laugh, saying, I couldn't do anything, now that the assets were already in his hands. I let them finish. Then I slid toward them the documents that had already been activated days earlier, right after I completed the verification of all evidence. I told them this clause was not a threat. It was a door. And that door had just been closed, by their own choices. Caleb jumped to his feet. He said I was destroying his future. He said I was selfish. I asked him where he had been when his mother needed a glass of water. That question silenced him for a few seconds. Then he turned away, without answering. The doorbell rang. I opened it. 2 bank representatives and 1 person from financial investigations stood there. I had scheduled their visit for this time, not to create a scene, but to make sure everything was recorded properly. They entered polite, professional. I made brief introductions. Caleb looked at them, then at me. His expression shifted from anger to confusion. They explained the temporary measures: revocation of asset access, freezing of related accounts, and the start of a review into transactions showing irregularities. No raised voices, no need for them. The silence was heavier than any accusation. Melanie began packing. No carefully folded dresses this time. Just things shoved quickly into bags. Caleb stood there, unmoving. I didn't demand that they leave that night, but they understood there was no place for them to stay. They walked out, carrying bags far lighter than everything they had taken from this home. When the door closed, I leaned against the wall. I felt no victory, only that something necessary had finally been done. I went back to the bedroom. Beatrice was awake. She asked if something was wrong. I told her everything was fine. I told her we would have some quiet for a while. That night I sat by the window looking down at the city. The lights were still on. Life kept moving, indifferent to the collapse of one small family. I thought about that moral clause. Many people had asked me why I included it. I had never answered. Tonight, I knew the answer clearly. Not to punish, but to remind us that some boundaries cannot be crossed. And when someone chooses to cross them, the consequences don't come from another person's anger, but from their own decisions. I closed the curtains, turned off the light. In the quiet room, I knew everything had taken a different path. Not easier, but more right. After that night, the penthouse became strangely quiet. No more hurried footsteps. No more whispered phone calls behind half-closed doors. Just Beatrice and me, returning to a slower rhythm we had lost long ago. I cleaned the house, not to erase anything, but to return everything to its proper place. Unnecessary items were put away. Corners that had been turned into displays were opened again, letting the light back in. I took Beatrice to her follow-up appointments under a new schedule. This time I wasn't worried about unclear expenses. Every decision was clean, transparent. The doctor said she qualified to be placed on the kidney transplant waiting list if we were prepared. I nodded. On the drive home, Beatrice stayed quiet for a long time. Then she asked a question that made me pull over to the side of the road. She asked if I had any regrets. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the years behind us, about the small warning signs I had ignored, believing family would correct itself. I told her that some decisions don't bring happiness, but they bring peace. And peace at our age is what we need most. Selling the penthouse happened faster than I expected. I didn't negotiate much. I didn't chase the highest price. I only needed a clean ending. When I signed the transfer papers, I didn't look out at Central Park one last time. I had looked enough. It was time to look forward. We moved to Boston, close to the hospital where Beatrice would receive long-term care. The new apartment was smaller. No high ceilings, no wide glass walls. But in the morning, sunlight fell just right onto the dining table. At night, it was quiet enough to hear the clock ticking. I grew used to making my own coffee, cooking simple dinners. Beatrice sat nearby. Sometimes she helped wash vegetables. Sometimes she just watched and smiled. Time moved slowly. The transplant happened a few months later. I waited in the hallway. I didn't read the news. I didn't check my phone. I just sat there, as if that alone was enough. When the doctor came out and said everything had gone well, I nodded. I thanked him, then sat back down. It took a few minutes before I realized my hands were shaking. During Beatrice's recovery, I stayed closer to her than ever before. We talked about very small things. The old kitchen, the beach trip we never took. The mornings she left early for work, while I rushed to court. No blame, just a late acknowledgement. One afternoon, when her strength had returned a bit more, I brought out a small box. Inside was the antique watch I had guarded most carefully in my collection. It wasn't flashy, but it had been with me through many important moments. Beatrice looked at it, then at me, and asked why I was giving it to her. I told her that some things were treated by others as rewards, but to me, they only mattered when given to the person who had walked beside me through the hardest years. She held the watch, said nothing, just squeezed my hand tightly. We began again, quietly. I no longer heard anything about Caleb or Melanie. I didn't look into it either. Some doors once closed don't need to be stood outside of. I spent my time reading, walking, learning to accept that not every relationship can be saved. One late autumn morning we sat in a small cafe near the hospital. Beatrice looked healthier, rosier. I looked at her, then out at the street where people hurried past with goals of their own. I thought about that sentence from years ago, the one that opened the door to everything that followed. I am not anyone's servant, and I don't need anyone to be mine. But in a family there are responsibilities that don't need titles. They exist simply because they are right. If there is one thing I learned from all of this, it's this. In the law, mistakes can be corrected with documents and money. But in a family, ingratitude leaves emptiness that nothing can ever fill. I was fortunate to close the door leading to that emptiness in time and open another path instead. Smaller, quieter, but warm enough for us to keep walking together. If you've listened this far, thank you for sitting with my story. If it made you think, or reminded you to value those who quietly stand beside you, please like, subscribe, and share this video so it can reach more people. Your support helps honest stories like this continue to be told. Thank you for listening, and I wish you a peaceful evening.